Please welcome to the stage Oliver Jeffers, visual artist, author, and climate activist.
Oh, hello. So, my name is Oliver, and I am an artist, but you could probably tell that already, because I'm wearing a hat. I also speak differently, and that's because of an accent, which I don't have. You all have an American accent from what I can hear. But if you're wondering where there is no accent, it's in Belfast in Northern Ireland. So we're pretty good at art there, and telling stories. And I've been telling lots of stories and lots of books for a long time. For 20 years, that's been my job. And people ask me a lot, where do I get my ideas for these books from? Maybe you've heard of some of them. And I tell people that they're all true stories, which they're not. I make them up. So I lie professionally to children. And I've been getting away with this for 2 decades. But for a long time, I've thought that these books were, or so I thought, simple distractions mostly enjoyed by children. But I've also, as much as I love making books, I've been a fine artist, and I've had a foot in the fine art world for the same amount of time, for 2 decades. And the art that I make is about trying to understand how the world around me works. Like science does, but with less accuracy or peer review. But my wife is an engineer, and when we met 20 years ago, she asked me, how do you give art a grade? I was like, I've been trying to answer that ever since. I don't really know. I think it's something to do with how much you have in your back pocket to back it up. But I've always believed in the power of art, and I've managed to convince a bunch of scientists and engineers that art is very important. In fact, maybe more important than science, because I've simply pointed out that science is how we do things, but art is why we do them. Anyway, art making, storytelling, 2 very different endeavors to me, or so I thought, until in 2015 these things collided when we had our first kid. We had a son who was born in New York, and as I walked around with him in the first few months of his life, I started explaining everything that he was seeing, as you do as a new parent. It's kind of wild, actually. They never make you take a test. You can just leave the hospital with a kid. But I was explaining everything I was seeing, and I thought it was hilarious because he didn't understand a word I was saying. He didn't speak any English. And I was trying to, explain everything. And it turned into alarm when I realized that he knew nothing about the way this world works. Absolutely zero. He didn't know how humanity governed itself. And like all fresh arrivals, he didn't know what it was to be a functioning member of society. He didn't know the difference between art and science, or that art was more important. So I realized that he would need to be taught everything without prejudice. And the magnitude that suddenly came with that. So another way of looking at this is that we all arrive on Earth as untold stories. Just no context, pure potential. We get to make it all up. And as I spoke to him of these things that he was seeing around him in those first few weeks of being a human, I began writing him a letter about just the simple beauty of what it is to be alive in the world, here in time and now in the universe. And partly to protect him what felt like an angrier and scarier world than usual, because maybe it was just me with the perspective of being a fresh parent, but I was noticing that at the time of his birth, the world really did seem to be an angrier, scarier place than usual. That there was a lot of angry people, there was a lot of blame and division and shouting, and the consensus was that we were sliding backwards somehow. So what began as a letter to him about the simple joys of being a person turned into a book called Here We Are, Notes for Living on Planet Earth, because I thought maybe other people would benefit from some of these simple truths I was remembering when I considered the state of the world from the perspective of joy rather than fear. And the more I considered the state of the world this way, the more I realized that our collective future maybe isn't in as bad a shape as we keep saying that it is. We might not be headed towards this dysfunctional dystopia that we're always hearing about, and maybe it's less that the world is actually unraveling, and more that we're now, for the first time in human history, just aware of everything that's happening everywhere, instantaneously, simultaneously, and it's overwhelming. You know, all these things have always been happening. There have always been these problems. They've just always been played out to the little areas where they were. So we have come a long way, so much so that it's easy to forget just the progress we've made. And take any of the major issues of today, like life expectancy or poverty or climate awareness, health, equality, and literacy, and compare them as a whole to where we were even 50 years ago in the mid-1970s. You know, they're all quantifiably better across the board, and that we feel so angry about many of these things, I think, is actually a step in the right direction than the indifference that we felt half a century ago. And if we go back even further than that, to about a century ago, children's books didn't exist. Why? Because kids didn't live predictably long enough to warrant having their own books. And we also forget, you know, in our constant complaining about how this miracle of life is, that the first person who suggested invisible little things that float through the air make us sick was locked in a mental asylum only 150 years ago. So we have come a long way. But there is still much to be worried about. And it is easy to feel that civilization is headed in the wrong direction. But the idea that we're all doomed and that the planet is broken doesn't sit well with me, because we're better than that. One of the strongest tools that we have at our disposal as artists is the ability to shift perspectives. A central aspect of this book, Here We Are, is the Earth's place in the cosmos. And in researching this, I came across a phenomenon known as the overview effect. And that is what happens to the human mind when it gets far enough away from the surface of our planet to see the whole thing as one object. And it completely changes how people perceive what we are up to on Earth from that distance. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, once famously said after coming back, it makes you want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck, drag him 250,000 miles away and say, look at that. So I thought this perspective shift was reserved exclusively for astronauts, but it turns out that might not be so, because having grown up in Northern Ireland, which is actually there, and has had a politically interesting history, and in trying to explain the violent nuance of our turbulent identity crisis to well-educated Americans in New York City there when we moved 17 years ago, most of them did not and still do not appreciate really that the island from whence I came is two separate countries, sort of. The top bit belongs to the island next door. And speaking from this distance across an ocean, the fighting back where I grew up just suddenly seems so pathetic, and what a tragic waste of life and energy. It was poignant. And I recognized the way that I was speaking about Northern Ireland from across an ocean was the same way that astronauts spoke about Earth from the distance of the moon. So the summer after my son was born, there was a lot of violence that had flared up again in Northern Ireland. And watching it from New York, I could see in the news footage that it was just like when I was a kid, that it was kids who were hijacking, burning buses and rioting with each other and the police. And I wondered what these teenagers really knew of the 800-year-old conflict that had preceded it. And the reality is, probably not much. They'd just been told a story by their parents that was validated by their peers. They had been told who to hate, and so they hated. And this is not the story that I want to tell my son of where he was from and where his family was from. And maybe my biggest epiphany as a human is that the most powerful thing we can do as civilized, conscious beings is to change the story. We can always, always change the story. A very potent thought when you realize that almost everything we know about ourselves comes from a story. We are no more than the stories we are told, the stories told about us, and the stories we tell. I said that just there now. And the most important story of all in there is the one that we tell ourselves, because this is the story of the sort of the person that we are and can be. And it gives us a sense of belonging and purpose, and that is where we can shift perspectives, the story that we tell ourselves. Everything can change depending on where we see it from or how we choose to see it. So on Apollo 8, when they went up in 1968 to look for a landing site for the Apollo 11 mission, they were the first people to see Earth from that distance and take that photograph that became known as the Earthrise photograph. But what's lesser known is that those three very intelligent astronauts, when they saw this giant landmass, they couldn't work out what part of Earth they were looking at. And it took them longer than they would care to admit that what they could see was the entire bottom half of Africa. They didn't recognize it because it was sideways. From space, it's obvious that there's no up, there's no down. We are a ball. North and south is just a story we told ourselves to give sense to chaos. And I made this map the wrong way around, but labeled everything the right way up because it's arbitrary for south to be at the bottom. And in pointing this out, something very familiar can suddenly seem really foreign when you look at it from another perspective. And even today, most of humanity's conflicts come from the ideas of national identities and maps and immigration and man-made problems that have nothing at all to do with the cosmological reality that we're floating through space on a ball. And wherever we go, we all go together. So given this, it's tragic to think of the waste of human energy, these big brains of ours that are spent on border battles, on imaginary lines, on who belongs where, given the magnitude of the threat of our home getting dangerously close to no longer being able to sustain life as we know it. And as we could clearly see during COVID, it's not so much border disputes or religious wars or occupations or who has what and who does not, or, as I heard recently, the haves and the have-yots. That will be the real threat to humanity. It's more likely going to be germs, or probably the weather that will make life for all no longer possible. And neither of these things needs a passport. This is why I think disunity is our greatest obstacle that we have to overcome. As different as we all culturally are, we're surprisingly similar as individuals. I've been all over the world on many book tours. I've been to almost all 50 states. I've met many people from all backgrounds, political leanings, belief systems, and I very much believe the vast majority of people on Earth are good people when it comes down to it. The problem just starts to happen when we think in groups about groups. I've never met a single human being who wants to be I mean, I've met plenty of people who are, but never met anybody who wanted to be one. And I think that's just not how they wanted to be seen. And I think my suspicion is that we're all so busy trying to be understood that we forget to try and understand, and we get misinterpreted and then double down in defense, being defined by an enemy, that we just are perceived to be assholes. So, I mean, I think we definitely toe the line sometimes, but it's only because our story becomes mutated. The story that we tell ourselves becomes mutated. It's the Northern Ireland problem. I sadly see now that the USA today is where Northern Ireland was in the mid-1970s, at the worst of our division. One group's identity is based on the perceived existence of an enemy. And it's possibly even where the climate debate is going, where, it's the between politicians and activists and those who absolutely know how they feel and are just bent on the existence of being right. So it got me thinking that everywhere, pretty much everyone is being taught that it's very important to be right. And we do mental somersaults to justify our past behavior based on this. But you will never get anybody to change their mind by telling them that they're wrong. And I think this is one of the biggest problems that just carries forward into the future as a defeat. But if we replaced the clash of right and wrong in any conflict or debate, no matter how big or small, personal or global, with the perception of better and worse, it should become much clearer what needs to be done, what it is we actually want, where we want to go. So what do we actually want? Have you ever noticed that when you ask people what they want, they tend to answer with what they don't want? And maybe it's because we basically have made it impossible to have public discourse between people who disagree with each other because we all feel under attack. We all feel that we must defend ourselves, or rather we must defend the story that we've told ourselves. So we're not getting the story that we were delivered or that we were promised. It must be somebody else's fault. And we can clearly see that when you look at it, all people, no matter where they're from or what they believe, they just want the same things: safety, community, dignity, and purpose. These should be easy for all living things to accomplish, so we can go on to focusing on other problems like this. But what if I told you we didn't have a climate problem? The world is not broken. It's doing exactly what it should. For all the problems we face in a rapidly growing, changing environment, there are solutions that we're just not rallying around. So it is a story problem that we have. We live in a cacophony of conflicting stories that cancel each other out and suit the person telling them, not the person being told to. And imagine a scenario we could all get behind, one single better story. Not one where we're too busy arguing over what to play in the radio of our spaceship to deal with the smoke coming out of the engine, but at this moment in history, we got to remember that we made it all up. And we can do it again, but this time in harmony. We have to start acting as one species with one destiny. We're not going to survive if we don't start doing that. So let's agree on a shared history. Remember to be better ancestors. This is the only place where people live. It's the only place where people can live. It's where all the music is made. It's where all the good food is. It's where all of the stories are told. It's where only place where anything means anything. Therefore, it is both the location of all the problems in the known universe and also the only place where we're going to find any of the solutions. So whatever story we tell of the future of life is down to us. We have work to do. Thank you.